introduce you. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see all of you on the Friday before Memorial Day weekend. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Joyce Beatty, Senior Historian at the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our program exploring the earliest days of photography. Invention and innovation have long been recognized as forces of change in American history and have become universal watchwords in the 21st century. Today, the idea of disruptive innovation is much in the news. The term is usually applied to very recent technologies that have displaced established ones. Yet the history of disruptive invention and innovation is long and multifaceted. The invention and dissemination of photography illustrates this point. In just a few years, in the middle of the 19th century, photography reframed how we looked at the world and ourselves. The daguerreotype was patented in France in 1839, but by 1851, this early photographic method had been so improved by American daguerreotypists that it was often dubbed the American process. In her new book, which is up here, The Early American Daguerreotype, Cross Currents in Art and Technology, author Sarah Kate Gillespie traces the activities of the unexpected mix of fine artists, scientists, inventors, and mechanical tinkerers who contributed to the daguerreotype's transformation. Today, Sarah Kate will give us a glimpse into that heady world of innovation. After her talk, we'll have time for questions, and then photography curator Shannon Parrish will share some of the treasures in the museum's daguerreotype collections. At the conclusion of our program, Sarah Kate will sign copies of her book, which will be available for sale right outside this room. I'm now delighted to introduce Sarah Kate Gillespie. She is the curator of American art at the Georgia Museum of Art, University of Georgia, where she also teaches in the Department of Art History. She was previously assistant professor of art history at York College, City University of New York, and curator of fine arts at the Brooklyn Historical Society. She has held predoctoral and postdoctoral fellowships here at the Smithsonian, as well as at the Terra Foundation for American Art, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Library Company of Philadelphia. Sarah Kate.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to keep this fairly casual today and just tell you a little bit about the genesis of the project and some of what I discuss in the book, some of the various concepts, and then of course if you want to read more, it is here. So this project has been a very long time in the making. It grew out of my doctoral dissertation, which I completed 10 years ago. But it has been inextricably tied to this institution since that time, and really this particular institution, not just the Smithsonian, but the National Museum of American History. I'm sorry, that is my noisy child. So I was incredibly fortunate to have, as Joyce mentioned, predoctoral fellowships, both at the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation specifically, which is where I first met Joyce. That was in the summer of 2005, and then it was followed by a joint fellowship working with Shannon Parrish, who we will meet later, and also Michelle Delaney, who is then curator of the Photographic History Collection, or they were both curators, here at the National Museum of American History, and that was joint with the National Portrait Gallery here at the Smithsonian, and that was over the academic year of 05-06 when I finished up this work. I was able to return again here to American History as a postdoctoral fellow in the summer of 2011, and working with Shannon. And in the fall of 2011, Michelle hosted a really wonderful mini symposium lecture series on the topic Inventing American Photography, with which I was thrilled to be involved. And it was at that symposium that Joyce approached me about presenting this book project for the Lemelson Centers, for potential publication with the Lemelson Centers series with MIT Press. And then it all grew into this book. So I remain always deeply grateful to Shannon and Michelle and Joyce for continuing to believe in my work over a decade now. So that's a long time. And I also want to thank Arthur Malella of the Lemelson Center, who is the series co-editor, for being amenable to taking on the project and being so supportive. So 10 years is, academically speaking, sort of a long time for the transition from your dissertation to your first book. But the project has really shifted a lot in that time frame, so I'm going to back up a little bit just as to how I came about this research in the first place. And it began, as many doctoral dissertations do, as a research paper for a graduate seminar. And in this case, it was a seminar at the City University of New York Graduate Center, where I did my doctoral work. And the seminar was based around an exhibition that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Art in the Empire City, New York, 1825 to 61. And that was at the Met in around 1999, 2000. And some of you may remember the show. Some of you may have seen the show. There was a really wonderful section on photography curated by Jeff Rosenheim. And it was for this seminar around this exhibition that I first was introduced to just the even idea of Samuel F.B. Morse and the daguerreotype, which I, as an Americanist, or as a, at that point, graduate student studying American art history, I knew that Samuel F.B. Morse was an important American painter. Here are two of his more well-known works, both of which, or not both of which, excuse me, the one on the left of which you get to see here at, I don't know if it's actually up right now, I don't think it is, but you get to see it down the road. It is formerly the Corcoran Collection, now at the National Gallery of Art. The one on the right was here very recently and had a nice long run just within the last couple of years at the National Gallery of Art, also the Gallery of the Louvre there. So I knew about Morse in this way, that he was this very important 19th century American artist, and I knew, of course, as most of us know of him, as the one of the progenitors of the electromagnetic telegraph. But what I did not know was that, of course, he was one of the first people in the country to work with the daguerreotype. And I thought, well, now isn't this fascinating, as many others have thought? And here's this guy who's an artist, he's interested in technology, he works with one of the first people to work with photography in this country. Surely people have written about this, surely it's out there. So I went digging around, and there wasn't that much out there. So I thought, well, that's going to be a great dissertation topic, and I'll find everything. And that was, yeah, yeah, go ahead and laugh. The naivete, right? So as it turned out, of course, there was some information about Morse and the daguerreotype. It was not terribly easy to find. It was sort of a difficult dissertation topic, actually, as it turned out. A lot of what is easily readily available had been discussed, and is probably known to most of you. It's discussed by his main biographers, it's discussed by main historians of the daguerreotype, scholars of the daguerreotype. Other information I did find, but I really had to dig to find it. I was able to find things like advertisements for his daguerreotype studio that had been previously unfound. Of course, I had to do that by reading countless newspapers and journals that were just produced in 1840 and 41. Luckily, a lot of hard copies of which are available at the New York Public Library. If you're ever looking to do that kind of research, they have everything. Or I found a description of his studio where a family member is writing about his Palace of the Sun, his daguerreotype studio, in some related family papers at the University of Rochester, which it looked like just nobody else had really looked at before for this particular material. So there were like little nuggets of that here and there. Or of course, this is, I cite it in the book as well, and here at the Vail Telegraph Papers at the Smithsonian Institution Archives, he has this long, beautiful description writing to Alfred Vail about taking what he would call an interior view, what we might call a still life, what I would like to term a still life, being an art historian. Basically, I read anything the man had written or that someone else might have written about or to him from the years 1839 or 42, anything I could get my hands on, sort of looking for needles in haystacks to think like, come on, aren't you talking about this? This is really cool. Someone's got to be talking about this. And I was lucky enough, like this, to stumble across a few needles. But I have to say, I'm sure there's way more out there that I was not able to find. It's sort of an endless task for any one scholar to try and find every last needle and every last haystack. And I just reached a point eventually where I felt like I had enough to compile a pretty definitive picture of Morse and the daguerreotype. And there's, by the way, one of his daguerreotypes. And in the words of a good friend who was a few years ahead of me in the doctoral process, who said, when it comes to a dissertation, don't let perfect get in the way of good enough. I felt like it was good enough and decided to move forward and let it go. Now, that said, there remained and remains the problem of the daguerreotypes themselves. Again, there just aren't that many of them, at least not that many that I was able to find and physically lay my hands on. In the end, I could not, again, physically eyeball more than 2 that I'm comfortable calling Morses, and I know there are more out there. But I only saw 2 of them. One, of course, is this piece at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we'll come back to that and talk about it a bit more later. We'll come back to Morse and Drake. Oh, no, we'll stick with Morse. Well, there's more. There he is. There's Morse on the left. And on the right is his brief photographic partner, chemist John William Draper, and medical doctor John William Draper, who we'll talk a bit more about. And we have a lot of his lovely images up here. And he's got a beautiful body of photographic work that is here just upstairs that Shannon works with daily if she chooses. At the she's shaking her head at me at the photographic history collection. Yeah. So this image, I strongly believe, I think I make a good case for it, was produced by the 2 of them together. In the spring of 1840 when they had their joint Daguerrean venture, again, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Now, more on this later. I have been told, and by reputable scholars, reputable collectors, that there are more Morse images. You can see here on the Met piece the SFB Morse stamp on the mat. Here is a mat without a daguerreotype in it in a collection that I know of that has a similar stamp. And again, I have been told, I have had letters passed to collectors who purportedly own other daguerreotypes. Some of you may have seen these, some of you may know where they are. I know the collection they're supposed to be in, and I never got to see them. I've heard from other dealers and collectors that these things are out there. I haven't seen one yet. If you know of one, if you have one, please let me know, and I will write an article about it. I want to know where they are and admire them. So again, as with the information, there's more out there. So in turning the dissertation into a book, that was sort of a lot of backstory, but in turning the dissertation into a book, as is common amongst us academic types, there are a couple of options. You can usually just kind of let the dissertation stand as it is and move on to a whole new thing, a whole new topic, and just let the dissertation be that definitive work. You can kind of monkey around with the dissertation a little bit and then just put it out there kind of as it is as a book, or you can do what I chose to do, which is, again, kind of take the hard road and revise it completely, expand the subject. At the risk of sounding too self-aggrandizing, I think it's a solid dissertation, but it's a pretty dissertation-y dissertation. It does what a dissertation is supposed to do. It's sort of the hoop you're supposed to jump through, but I think it's a little bit too full of minutia. It's a bit too inside baseball for a general book audience. This crowd, if you're interested enough to come on a Friday afternoon to a talk about 1840s American photography, you might be that crowd, you might be that inside baseball crowd, and find it all fascinating. But for general, more of a general academic or general audience, I was like, maybe we expand the subject a little bit. Also, I had come to see, and this is the more important point, I had come to see in the process of writing that dissertation that Morse's story of having a foot really in both camps, right? A foot in the field of fine art and a foot in technology, and sort of his story of how he evolved through that and decided in the end to work, sort of hedge his bets with technology and leave fine art behind. It really serves as sort of a stand-in for a much larger, much more complex, much more interesting, perhaps, story about this particular period in American culture. One where the various disciplines of art and science and technology were evolving in new and exciting ways. And the daguerreotype, it seemed, was a perfect, pardon the pun please, but a perfect lens. But it was a perfect lens through which to examine these kinds of changes. And so that is how I decided to move on to this. So that's how the topic for the book evolved, which of course meant more research. And because I needed certain limiting parameters, there they are again. Oh, this is what I was going to talk about. I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself and my slides did not keep up with my talk. Back to this beautiful image, which again, I'll talk a bit more about, but when I was talking about this sort of, cross currents is the term I use in the book, but confluences could be another term. These intersections of these various disciplines, it's really sort of captured and pictured in this daguerreotype because we have, the prints after fine art, we think they're prints, married with the scientific instruments, including the chemistry textbook. And there's just a detail of that. That's Hare's chemistry. Hare was Draper's professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Robert Hare. So, okay, limiting parameters. So I chose to decide to stick to the start and put that in extreme quotes, start date of 1839 for the daguerreotype, and ended at 1851. And as I explained in the introduction of the book, by 1851, I chose that as the end date because by then the daguerreotype had two journals devoted to its production, one which started in 1850, the other in 1851, devoted to its not just production, but also its aesthetics, its practices. And also, of course, 1851 was the date of the London Crystal Palace exhibition, which I always feel is just sort of this moment of crowning glory for the American daguerreotype, when we beat the world. So says Horace Greeley. I also decided to limit my discussion to primarily New York City and Philadelphia. You got to cut things off somewhere where the majority, but certainly not all, of the important, very early Daguerrean activity was taking place. And this is when I went on and did the further work that Joyce mentioned at the American Antiquarian Society and the Library Company of Philadelphia, and then again came back here for my postdoctoral fellowship to continue working with these really rich collections. And that's also why you'll see a lot of images from those three institutions, American Antiquarian, Library Company, and here, American History Illustrated in the book. So one of the challenges, of course, in writing about an interdisciplinary topic is sort of how to organize the material, how to approach all these different disciplines, and somewhat contradictorily. In this case, it really seemed one of the best ways to do this was to divide the chapters by discipline, and that's how I approached it. I tried, though, very hard, and Joyce is my editor, and the readers, the peer reviewers through MIT Press helped me keep the interdisciplinary thread sort of at the forefront throughout the text. Morse serves as the opening chapter, as and there he is again, his Gallery of the Louvre on the right and that still life on the left. As the opening chapter is, again, he was the genesis for this whole project, so that whole dissertation got kind of shriveled down into a chapter. And he really does provide this perfect case study for that marriage of art and technology and science and all of these things, particularly in that partnership with the chemist and medical doctor John William Draper. And one of my favorite comparisons in the book and in general was and still is always this one between these two images of Morse's, the still life that he produced with Draper, I believe, and that Gallery of the Louvre on the right, where he's just sort of serving as this controlling agent in both. So for those of you unfamiliar with the painting on the right, it's a large painting. It's probably maybe a little bit smaller than the projected area of the screen, a little smaller than that. So that's pretty big, though, for a painting. And in the painting, there's Morse himself. He's painted himself right into the work. Leaning over who we think is James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, who is studying, who's here painting, copying one of the works on the wall. So he has gone through the Louvre Museum, and he was doing this in around 1830 or 31, and choosing the works in the Louvre Museum that he thought were the most significant, the most important, that American audiences should view. So his goal was, and he was in Paris doing this, we think, there's pretty good solid proof that he used, and Paul Stady at Mount Holyoke College, who was a Morse expert on his painting, observe this first. This was not my original fantastic thought. But that he used probably a camera obscura. It's there in the literature. He talks about it. And we have, especially with this painting right here, this Francis I painting, there is a tracing in reverse that he probably actually traced from the camera obscura and then used as a basis to create his copy to then add into his painting here. So he used this camera obscura, he takes copies of some of the works that he thinks are the most significant, and then he sort of reassembles them in this gallery. And then so this is not what was in this gallery exists in the Louvre Museum, but this is not what existed at the time that he was there in 1830. It actually had, I think, the Raft of the Medusa, which was a, to then, contemporary painting. So he meant for this to come back and then tour the United States and sort of make him all this money, and it was commercially somewhat a failure, and it did not do those things. And the Terra Foundation has done a fabulous job. They have a wonderful video, I think it's on their website if you want to look it up, discussing this painting and its restoration. Anyway, but I feel like he does sort of a very similar thing here with this, and it's almost like in this very early moment, I mean, this is spring of 1840, so he's been working with this process for less than a year. He has been introduced to the process of the daguerreotype for just a little over a year, and by introduced, just even known that it existed. As he hears about it, he's in Paris when the process is announced by Arago in Paris, and wrangles this meeting. It's sort of a famous story. Wrangles this meeting with Daguerre, of course, and goes and has this like, you show me yours, I'll show you mine kind of moment where he says, can I see the daguerreotype and I'll show you the telegraph? And so they have this exchange, and he writes about it, and it's this famous letter. But I feel like he's really thinking long and hard, what can I do with this? This is this revolutionary medium, and he's already thinking about reproducibility, right? Because he's thinking about the telegraph when he's in Paris in 1839. That's what he's there to do. He's there to promote it. So he's like thinking about reproducibility. I'm thinking about things traveling far and wide, and what do we do with that? What does that mean for the visual? What does that mean for the visual? And so if he wants this to travel far and wide also, I feel like this is sort of a little experiment of like, well, what if I put art in here, and that could travel far and wide, that could serve in some way. This is one of my thoughts. Now, two of these works in here we know are after works that are actually in the Louvre Museum and certainly would have been there when Morse was there, which may just be coincidence, but may be amongst his or possibly Draper's vast collection of prints, which most, any educated person, and especially one interested in the fine arts like Morse, when he taught fine art, when he was president of the National and co-founder of the National Academy of Design, would have had at his disposal. He may have gone and deliberately chosen things that were at the Louvre. He may have also just chosen the ones because these, they're all faces. That's no accident. He may have just chosen them for their formal qualities. We don't know. But there's one that's probably Parmigianino, though it's attributed to various individuals. His portrait of a young man, there he is. This was just a guess on my part. I haven't been able to identify this young lady yet. She looks to me like a sort of Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun type of neoclassical painting, but that's something else if anyone ever figures out what that is. I'd love to know. And then we have this sculpture here, which, he's just sort of carefully positioned so the drape is brushing her cheek. It's this sort of wonderful little trompe l'oeil kind of quality. There's the other one. I've been questioned on this, but I stand by it. I swear that that's Leonardo's angel from the Madonna of the Rocks. If you look at the drapery on the shoulder and the way the hair is, of course it's flipped, so that's also at the Louvre Museum. There it is again. So I talk about that sort of thing a lot in the first chapter. It's really all about Morse. Morse's various studios, sort of, lay those out. But then, speaking of art, the second chapter moves into art. So I wanted to look very hard and long at how artists used the daguerreotype, how daguerreans themselves either emulated or rejected artistic conventions. I was also interested in daguerreotypes of fine art and sort of the use for that and the circulation of those plates. And again, these are the sorts of things where you find stuff out after the book comes out. You know, there's a collector now. I was writing most of this when I was living in New York. I'm now, as you saw, down in Georgia, and there's a collector in Savannah who only collects daguerreotypes of images after fine art, which, you know, I just met him recently. And I thought, well, shoot, I would have really liked to have known about you a year ago. But, you know, these things happen. And these are just two of those examples, two of the things that are illustrated in the book, just because I want to, you know, this was used for sculpture, it was used for images of painting. I love these sorts of things where we have, you know, this is Nancy Southworth with her painted portrait in the daguerreotype. You know, you sort of wonder, what is this? This sort of meditation on modes of representation, modes of portraiture, modes of self-portraiture, of course, by, she was an artist and, you know, married to a daguerrean. And this Shannon brought this down for you to see in person today, Thomas Easterly's daguerreotype of Charles Diaz's painting, A Solitary Indian. Now, when I was first working on this, this painting was considered lost, and this daguerreotype was one of the only ways we knew, and some other records were one of the few ways that we knew it actually existed, had ever existed. I don't know what happened. I don't know the provenance. It must have just been sort of languishing in a private collection, as sometimes works of art do, and then they get termed lost because they, you know, it's all pre-internet, you know. We didn't know where it was. There was not a record of, you know, nobody had bothered, maybe nobody had done the research as to where it had gone, but it is now in the Autry Museum in Los Angeles, the Autry National Center in Los Angeles. So the painting has recently resurfaced, which is fabulous. I haven't had a chance to see it yet. So again, these kinds of daguerreotypes, again, not only provide a valuable record of fine art that might not have survived, but again, enrich the ways Americans thought to utilize the new medium and the context in which it circulated. Another one of my favorite images from this particular chapter on fine art is this sort of, again, endless reproducibility of the Greek slave, which you, again, can see just down the street now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Curator Karen Lemmy has done a beautiful job talking about and discussing Hiram Powers' sculpture there, and it was one of the most daguerreotype sculptures or daguerreotype pieces of art in general, as far as I've been able to tell, in the mid-19th century. But then there are curious pieces like this one over here, which I just sort of stumbled across, which is, I don't know this painting. If anyone knows the original source for the painting, I'd be fascinated. But there's apparently somewhere existed, someone painted a version of the sculpture and then added these sort of curious, you know, these figures in the background, very sort of exoticizing in that 19th century mindset. And so we have a painting after a sculpture, which has then been daguerreotyped to circulate. So again, these layers and layers and layers of reproducibility I find really fascinating that the daguerreotype affords. And wanted to explore again how those things circulated and why they circulated, that kind of thing. No, I just, more page. So, okay, back to Draper quickly. So the third chapter deals with Mr. Draper here. This image, I'm sorry I don't have a tagline here, but this is actually also at the Smithsonian, though it is not with Shannon. It is not in photographic history. It is actually over with the Department of Medicine and Science, down the hall from them, from photographic history. But there he is. There's Mr. Draper. And the third chapter looks more at science. Here is where they had their joint studio. This was the old university building on Washington Square's east side. University, what would now be New York University. This is where both Morse and Draper taught in this one building, and their partnership studio was on apparently one of these the rooftops, one of these crenellated towers. So we think like right around in something like that, one of these actually would be here, would have been. Now, Draper was among the few Americans and of those working in America, because he was actually, of course, British by birth. He had immigrated from Britain. that I was able to find who used the daguerreotype for the exploration of hard sciences. This, of course, despite the fact that some rudimentary knowledge of science is required to create a Daguerrean image at all, especially chemistry. But this is, of course, partially why Morse approached him. We assume Morse approached him, but we actually don't know. Maybe they just got to talking one day and they decided to do it together. We assume Morse approached him, though, because apparently first Morse over here approached Wolcott, who is represented by his camera. I've never been able to find an image of Wolcott, though I did find a print after one of his daguerreotypes, Alexander Wolcott, another one of these early daguerreans. So Morse did approach Wolcott first to be his photographic partner. Wolcott apparently said, no, I've already got this guy, chemist John Johnson, who I'm way more interested in working with. And so then we're not sure how these two cooked this up, but they did. And Shannon has brought this plate down for you. But Morse was smart enough to know that, he was smart enough to know what he didn't know, even if he did not like to say so publicly, because he was really a master of self-promotion. But he was smart enough to know that I don't know something and to seek help and partnership when he needed it. And again, it was this partnership, this is again why Morse is part of the first chapter, it was this partnership that sort of serves as, again, as a stand-in for a lot of partnerships that were going on between these early daguerreans, which I'll talk a lot more about in chapter 4. But there was sort of this network of experimenters where they all traded all kinds of information, like these first 5 years or so. Draper, though, was really a hard scientist, and he used the process of daguerreotyping in an effort to answer theoretical questions about, among other things, for example, the nature of light. Some of his interesting and most compelling plates are those of solar spectra. Oh yes, this. I'll come back to the spectra because they're fascinating. This is the portrait of his sister, Dorothy Catherine Draper, which has been sort of gotten this reputation somewhere down the line as the first Daguerrean portrait. We know it's not. But it's an early one, and it's a beautiful one, and it is here for us to look at. Yes. And Shannon brought not just this, but many of his spectra daguerreotypes for you to look at, and they're just absolutely beautiful. So these gorgeous plates, which almost resemble to our eyes maybe, modern art, because there's this sort of abstraction, right? They were scientifically, though, not very helpful, not very sort of useless without this kind of written augmentation, because they're missing the thing that a solar spectrum is known for and what its most essential characteristic, we'll come back to this, there they all are, which is color, right? And that really tells you where they line. So when he actually publishes his results for the first time, he does it in this book, his book, A Treatise on the Forces which Produce the Organization of Plants. And he publishes, I might be missing, it might be The Forces of Nature which Produce the Organization of Plants. I apologize if I'm missing part of that title. But he publishes this lovely hand-colored plate in the front of that book after the daguerreotype, because of course, the technology to reproduce a photograph in a text does not yet exist, but also then he can include the color. So this is just another one of his plates that is similarly augmented as our example here from upstairs. This one, though, is in Britain. It's in Bradford at the National Museum of, I think, the Television and Film in Bradford, Media, thank you, Media in Bradford. Yes, and it was the one that he sent to John Herschel. So yeah, so it's a lovely thing, and they're lovely together, and she has several examples here. And then Shannon also brought this one down to see, just as I'm also, I feel like I'm running low on time, so I'm going to wind down. One in which Draper didn't only use the daguerreotype to experiment with hard science. On at least one occasion, he seemed to play around with the same sorts of ideas that he worked on with Morse, where he titles it Composition, where he wants to work on, making a pleasing composition with some of the, as we assume, fine art prints and sculptures that he might have around his house. Now, we think this is not done with Morse. It is later, and that I was able to determine, I detail why in the book, but the short answer is when I was here as a pre-doctoral fellow, Michelle very kindly arranged for us to do X-ray fluorescence spectrography on almost all of these plates which tells us the chemical makeup and composition of the plate, so we could tell what was gilded and what was not, and the surface, sort of, textures and qualities, and it revealed a lot. It was incredibly revealing and helped us date a lot of these things and figure out which were earlier, which were a little later, that kind of thing. So, Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with technology. It's sort of the summation of all of this, because in many ways I felt like technology served as, in some ways, sort of the linchpin of all of these other elements within the American daguerreotype. At least that is one of my main theses here in this book. Now, I've gotten some pushback for my insistence on the importance of the term the American process, which is the title of this chapter. So, namely, in reaction to my use of this term, one scholar went to great lengths to prove that the term was not used that widely in Europe. That Europeans did not say the American process. And said, okay. Well, the argument that I make, though, and which I spell out in this chapter, is not actually about European perceptions of the daguerreotype. I am less interested in that for this particular book. It is not. It is a very interesting subject, but and I got, possibly from the same scholar, one of my anonymous reviewers from MIT Press, again, was like, well, what about the daguerreotype in America? Like, how did Europeans perceive it and react to it? And I think it's a whole different book, so I didn't really go into that. But rather, with this term, the American process, I am interested in is how 19th century Americans reacted to the idea of the term. Sort of whether it was actually used in Europe is less the point. So the argument I make, again, not about European perceptions of the daguerreotype, because my work is not, I'm not personally interested in, and my work is not intended to further any kind of nationalizing discourse, right? The point, though, that Americans believed, even if they were lying to themselves, that they believed it was used thusly in Europe, that is what is important. That is very interesting to me, is that they wanted to take this European invention and Americanize it and take it for their own. And this is, in maybe perhaps aggrandizing, though those are very real technological advancements, maybe they did aggrandize them, but it doesn't really matter. They said that they had these advancements and they wanted to celebrate them. So that, in sort of a roundabout way, is one of the main concepts that I focus on in Chapter 4. So I relate the daguerreotype to what historian of technology David Nye calls his concept, I guess I should say, of American foundational technology stories, which he applies to technologies such as the axe, the canal, and the railroad. And I situate the daguerreotype. I propose that it could also be one of these foundational technology stories, even though it is not, in fact, an American invention, but that they took it and ran with it and sort of Americanized it. So I spend a lot of time in this, and there's one of the main quotes about the American process from the opening journal or the opening issue of the Daguerrean Journal. So here's some of our motley crew of characters again, our cast of characters. Because this is where I spend more time discussing this network of experimenters that made these advancements possible. These fellows all knew each other and they all shared information. So we have Morse again, Wolcott again represented by his camera, Draper. This is Joseph Saxton of Philadelphia. Saxton, of course, ruled a diffraction grating for Draper so he could make those beautiful prismatic spectra I was just showing you earlier. Saxton also knew Robert Cornelius in Philadelphia. Cornelius working with Paul Beck Goddard in Philadelphia. And they're all sort of somehow one way or another exchanging information to advance the process. And I also spent quite a bit of time talking, and I don't have an image of him, but thankfully we have many here in person, which is even better, talking about people like Henry Fitz Jr., so I go straight a little bit outside of New York and Philadelphia and look at him in Baltimore, whose telescope laboratory is located here at the museum, upstairs also. And of course, Philadelphia-based experimenters such as Robert Cornelius. So one of the things I found to be the most sort of significant indicator about the daguerreotypes new, and I think to Americans in previous talks I've called it confounding to them, but it was rather confusing, confounding, interdisciplinary status in its initial years was the actual confusion over where to place it in things like mechanics and industrial fairs. So these fairs that circulate or that were very popular in the mid-19th century and then through the end of the 19th century that had all kinds of things like, all kinds of industrial goods, all kinds of mechanical goods, fine art. They were somewhat separate from the fine art exhibitions, though, at places like the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, the National Academy of Design. But I trace in the book the daguerreotype gets placed in all kinds of different places. They don't know what to do with it in the first couple of years especially. Sometimes they're like, does it go in fine art? Does it go in dyes and engravings? Where do we put this thing? And then finally, sometimes people just create finally after a couple of years, they're like, we're just gonna have a daguerreotype category because it doesn't really go with any of this stuff. But interestingly enough, a few years more down the line, when this paper processes they of course exist concurrently with the daguerreotype, but when they become a bit more popular here in the United States, those processes wind up definitely in the fine arts department. So they are separated out. So there's something about this hard metal plate that keeps it. It's been this early period, and it would be very interesting to sort of see how this progresses with other things like the tintype and the ambro. That was a little beyond the scope of this project, so I didn't do it. But I would be interested to see that research. So between the American daguerreotypes reception in England and France, there are many, many things that were not in the scope of this project that I would like to see somebody do, and there are others than that as well. So if nothing else, though, I sincerely hope that my contribution to the discussion of the American daguerreotype sparks more research into this significant and important medium. I guess I can end there because I was getting a signal.
We have time for a few questions. No questions. She's answered all your questions. There we go.
Briefly, what might be the distinction between the invention and the American process? What technically might be different between the two?
What kinds of processes were further that made it the American process? What's kind of funny is that actually, is as far as I was able to find, and again, if somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, in the literature itself, when it talks about the American process, they don't say. They don't, but my guess it would be things like, the advancements made in gilding and polishing the plates and buffering the plates, these kinds of things that just made the image that much sharper and crisper and more beautiful. So I think those are the types of things, yeah. And those were American advancements, yeah.
You can tell the difference
Please.
between an American plate and a British or a European plate.
Mm-hmm.
And from the same period, the European plates looked earlier.
Yeah.
They're exactly contemporary. And it was really a question of polish, a matter of polish.
It was really the polish. Would have been my guess, yeah.
I was a little curious about your selection of the 1851 date as sort of the end of the period that you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering to what extent the invention of positive and negative media on photographic media on glass had to play with that.
That's a great point, and that would be, I didn't take that into consideration because I feel like it took a few more years for those to become really popularized, even though it was invented in 51, but that could sort of easily be another reason for the marking. I really picked it just because I felt by 51 the American daguerreotype had its identity. It was pretty cemented, it was pretty solid, and so I was interested in looking at those years of genesis and of identity formation, if you will. And it seems sort of baffling to me now that I didn't consider the glass plate invention of 51, Archer's contribution in 51 to be tied into that. But again, I feel like it took a couple years for it to kick in, especially in America.
I was thinking more specifically about the Langenheims or 1849 and Niepce in Europe as well.
Well, I mean, the negative and positive without the glass plate, of course, with paper, negatives, that was going on, since prior to 39. So it was always there. It just, the negative positive process is, running simultaneously to the daguerreotype. It just wasn't, I talk about this a little bit, and a lot of scholars have sort of tossed around the question as to why it just didn't catch on here as well. One of my main conceits is that it was the sort of technology, that we like technology. We're a country that likes technology, and just something that really was interesting to us, and the fact that we could advance upon it. Not that you can't advance upon the paper process, that was advanced upon as well, but yeah.
I thought 1851 was a great selection.
Oh, thank you. Well, good. I'm glad. At least. Yes, sir.
So there's this famous quote, the past is another country, and it kind of implies you can never really get into people's minds. But at the same time, as you did this, I'm wondering, you must have kind of thought to yourself, the way I see these today is different because, of course, I've been disciplined or trained to look at photographs, at images in different ways, like look for fakes or just see collages in different ways. What's your sense? Two things, really. So what's your sense of how people at that time were looking at these, how different that is from how we might, which is, of course, speculative. And the other one is more technical, which is how physically different are they today than they were? In other words, have they degraded, or am I looking at something that's fundamentally the same as when it was produced?
I can answer the second question first. It just depends on the plate, depends on the image. Sometimes you're lucky enough to come across one. I'm sure a lot of people have had this experience. You're lucky enough to come across one that's just gorgeous, right? That's just like in perfect shape, that has just been so beautifully preserved that it probably looks almost the same as to when it was produced, with some degradation, but mostly, really fabulous. And then, I have a vast collection of, flea market finds that I use for teaching purposes, that are all range of shapes. So it depends on the image. And the first question, that also I think is, people wrote about this, so that's, I think, how we know how they reacted to it and what they thought of it. People wrote about it quite widely. People said, I think it's, what they thought about it, and so I think as a historian, it's, I feel like my art historian, and emphasis on historian, people always ask, oh, do you make photographs? I was like, well, with my iPhone, but no, otherwise I don't. I'm really a historian, and as more than an artist, and I think that's, you try always, at least I try always, to think about how the original viewer or sitter or creator might have thought about and worked with the image. That's, of course, always going to be different than how we're doing it today. But having all those primary source records and documents of the reactions, especially in the case of the daguerreotype, is so valuable. I think one thing we sometimes forget and take for granted, that maybe other historians and scholars of daguerreotyping, though, are maybe more cognizant of, is just how startling it was, how weird it was, how new it was. People write about this sense of dislocation, in seeing it, and Alan Trachtenberg is probably the scholar, the former professor at Yale, American Studies, who retired, emeritus professor, I should say, but still with us. He, I think, writes the most beautifully about this, and did most of the groundbreaking research on all that in literary sources. Yeah.
I think we'll have to cut off questions here, but we'll invite you, of course, to talk one-on-one with Sarah Kate as she signs books that you're all going to buy.
Says my editor.
Well, I want to bring Shannon up now. So
Yes,
thank
please.
you so much, Sarah Kate.